In 356 BCE, a boy named Alexander was born in the ancient city of Pella, nestled in the rugged heartlands of Macedonia, and his name would echo across history. The world he entered was fractured, filled with rival kingdoms, tribal warfare, and endless ambition. But for Alexander, the very moment of his birth seemed to whisper destiny. His father, King Philip II of Macedon, was no ordinary ruler. He was a military genius in his own right, who had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into a formidable power. With diplomacy, ruthlessness, and sheer tactical brilliance, Philip had forged alliances, crushed enemies, and created a professional army unlike anything Greece had seen. But he wasn't just building an empire, but crafting a legacy. His mother, Olympias, was of royal blood from Epirus and was even more fascinating. She was deeply religious, fiercely proud, and unwavering in believing her son was destined for greatness. There were whispers in the dream that a thunderbolt struck her womb, a sign believed to be from the night of Alexander's conception that her child would be divine. Rumors spread that Zeus himself was the boy's true father. From the moment Alexander could walk, he was immersed in a world of power, myth, and war. He listened to tales of Achilles and Heracles, not as distant legends, but as personal ancestors. And from an early age, he sought to emulate them. One of the most famous stories from his childhood involved a horse, Bucephalus. The animal was wild, uncontrollable, and deemed too dangerous by Philip's handlers. But Alexander, only 12 years old, noticed that the horse feared its shadow. Calming it, turning it toward the sun, and mounting it effortlessly, he rode Bucephalus with such skill that onlookers were left speechless. Philip was moved to tears. "My son," he said, "you must find a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small." Alexander never forgot those words. They became a prophecy he would spend his life trying to fulfill. His education was as intense as his upbringing. At 13, Philip appointed Aristotle his tutor. Alexander was immersed in philosophy, science, politics, poetry, and ethics for 3 years. He studied under trees and in open courtyards and traveled across the land with Aristotle, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. But this was no idle schooling. Aristotle constantly challenged him, instilling a worldview that viewed knowledge and conquest as complementary. Alexander learned to question, to reason, and most importantly, to lead. Tragic events frequently coincide with opportunities. In 336 BCE, during a celebration of his daughter's wedding, King Philip was assassinated by one of his bodyguards. The motive remains murky to this day. Was it personal revenge, a political conspiracy, or perhaps, as some whispered, a plot involving Olympias herself? What is certain is that Alexander secured his claim to the throne within days, even though he was only 20 years old. Many in Macedonia doubted him. He was young and charismatic, yes, but unproven. To assert his authority, Alexander acted swiftly and brutally. He executed rivals, including potential claimants to the throne, and led a lightning campaign across Greece to suppress rebellion. Thebes, once a mighty city-state, dared to rise against him. Alexander destroyed Thebes. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was clear. Alexander would not tolerate dissent. The other Greek states, Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, took notice. They acquiesced. In less than a year, Alexander was not only the king of Macedonia, but also the hegemon of Greece, the supreme commander of a coalition army meant to invade Persia. It was the mission his father had planned. Now, it was his. And so, with rebels' blood still fresh in the soil, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. Persia awaited. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with around 40,000 men. He stopped at Troy, where he honored Achilles' tomb. According to legend, he laid a wreath upon it and declared Achilles lucky to have lived such a life, and had such a friend in Patroclus. The symbolism was powerful. Achilles had been his hero. Alexander would now write his epic. The first significant clash came at the Granicus River. The Persian satraps had prepared for him. Alexander's advisors warned him to wait and cross at a safer point. But Alexander, ever daring, led a direct assault across the river. He nearly died when a Persian noble struck him with an axe, but was saved only by a quick-thinking officer who killed the attacker mid-swing. The victory at Granicus provided access to Asia Minor. City after city surrendered. But Alexander wasn't just conquering, he was winning hearts. In many places, he restored democratic governance, lowered taxes, and punished corrupt Persian officials. To the oppressed, he was a liberator. Then came Issus. The Persian king, Darius III, finally responded with a massive army, over 100,000 strong. Alexander had less than half that. The two armies met in a narrow coastal plain where Darius's numbers were useless. Alexander personally led the cavalry charge that shattered the Persian center. Darius fled in panic, leaving behind his family and royal treasures. When Alexander found Darius's mother and wife in his tent, terrified of execution, he treated them with dignity and respect. This act of honor elevated his reputation beyond military skill. He wasn't just winning wars, he was building a legend. By 332 BCE, Alexander had marched south into Egypt. Unlike the Persian strongholds he had crushed, Egypt welcomed him. They had suffered under Persian rule for generations. Alexander arrived not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, wrapped in fine linen, presented before sacred bulls, and blessed by Amun-Ra priests. The coronation was more than symbolic. In the eyes of the Egyptians, he became a living god, an incarnation of Horus. Statues were raised, and his name was inscribed in hieroglyphs beside the gods of old. But Alexander wasn't content with the ceremony. He made a daring journey into the heart of the Libyan desert to visit the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. This was not a simple pilgrimage. The journey was long, treacherous, and full of omens. At one point, the guides lost their way, and the caravan nearly perished. Yet according to legend, two ravens appeared and led them to safety, while a sudden rainstorm saved them from thirst. The oracle welcomed Alexander with immense honor. What exactly was said remains a mystery. Some claimed the priests addressed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Others said the oracle confirmed his divine birth outright. Either way, from that moment on, Alexander acted not merely as a king, but as a demigod destined to rule the known world. In Egypt, he founded Alexandria, a city envisioned as a beacon of culture, knowledge, and commerce. He laid out its streets himself, using barley flour to mark the grid, which was then swept away by birds, an omen the priests interpreted as a sign of divine favor. Alexandria would become the jewel of the Mediterranean, a living legacy long after his empire faded. In 331 BCE, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius had prepared meticulously. The Persian army was enormous, its front line stretching for miles. They had scythed chariots with spinning blades, war elephants armored for devastation, and legions of archers, cavalry, and spearmen. Alexander camped the night before under a full moon. He slept soundly, unlike his generals, who were anxious and restless. When asked how he could rest peacefully, he replied, "We are already victorious." The battlefield was flat, chosen by Darius to use his chariots to maximum effect. But Alexander, ever the tactician, had studied the terrain and created flexible formations to absorb and flank the attacks. As dawn broke, he delivered a rousing speech to his men, reminding them that they were fighting not just for conquest, but for history. Midway through the battle, Alexander spotted a gap in the Persian center. He led the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge, cutting through the enemy like a lightning strike. He aimed directly for Darius. Chaos erupted. Darius fled the battlefield again, abandoning his royal standard and treasure. But behind the glory was tragedy. The Persians suffered tens of thousands of casualties. One account tells of a Persian noble who remained to fight after Darius fled, refusing to abandon his king. He died surrounded by Macedonian swords, refusing to yield. Alexander was left with the spoils of empire, the cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. When he entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, he walked through halls of gold and columns towering like trees. There, perhaps in a moment of triumph or madness, he allowed the palace to be burned. Some say at the urging of an Athenian courtesan, others say as an act of vengeance. The flames that consumed Persepolis lit the sky for days, symbolic of the end of an ancient era. Even after Persia fell, Alexander was unsatisfied. He pushed eastward into the unknown, beyond the edge of the Greek world, into Bactria and Sogdiana, lands of icy peaks, harsh deserts, and rebel chieftains. These were no easy conquests. The terrain was brutal, and the people were fiercely independent. He fought guerrilla warfare, stormed mountain fortresses, and even scaled a sheer cliff to capture the seemingly impregnable Sogdian rock. Here he met Roxana, the daughter of a local chieftain. She was intelligent, beautiful, and brave. Their marriage was both political and personal. Alexander fell for her deeply. It was said he watched her dance to celebrate her people's surrender and was immediately captivated. She became his queen and bore his only legitimate child. His journey into India was one of both wonder and horror. He encountered cities rivaling Greece's beauty, sophistication, and armies that challenged even his hardened veterans. The Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus was unlike anything before. War elephants trampled men underfoot, and horses bolted in terror. Adapting quickly, Alexander encircled the Indian army and successfully captured Porus. When asked how he should be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander admired his spirit and appointed him governor of his lands. This blend of conquest and magnanimity made him unforgettable. Yet the further he marched, the more his men wearied. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, they refused to go on. They had witnessed the world's edge and desired to return home. Alexander raged, pleaded, and isolated himself in silence for 3 days. But eventually, he relented. Alexander conceded to return west after his army refused to push further east beyond the Hyphasis River. But instead of retracing the safer route they had used to enter India, he chose a bold, perilous path through the Gedrosian Desert. It may have been a test of will or an attempt to outdo Cyrus the Great, who lost his army there centuries ago. The desert was merciless. Blazing heat, scarce water, and blinding sandstorms plagued their march. Men and animals collapsed in the unforgiving terrain. Supplies meant to sustain them failed to arrive. Hunger and thirst became constant companions. Alexander marched beside his men, sharing every hardship. When offered water, he famously poured it out, refusing to drink unless his soldiers could too. Some accounts recall his efforts to aid stragglers and send ahead for water. One tale tells of a half-dead soldier whom Alexander carried to safety, a rare moment of compassion in the cruelty of survival. By the time they reached Carmania, thousands had perished. Alexander led a ceremonial procession to mark their survival, but the parade couldn't mask the deep scars left by the desert. Returning west, Alexander turned to ruling rather than conquering. He established cities across Asia, many named after himself and some after his horse Bucephalus, who had died in India. He adopted Persian dress and rituals and began referring to himself with divine titles. At Susa, he held a grand ceremony, the Susa weddings. He and 90 of his officers married Persian noblewomen. It was a statement. This was not an occupation. It was a fusion of East and West. But not everyone approved. His Macedonian soldiers grumbled. Some refused to accept foreigners as equals. Alexander's order to integrate Persian soldiers into his elite units escalated the tensions. The veterans saw this as a betrayal. He addressed them directly, reminding them that their loyalty had earned the world's admiration, but that the future lay in unity. Despite his attempts at harmony, cracks deepened. In a drunken quarrel, he killed Clitus the Black, the man who had once saved his life at Granicus. Alexander was devastated. He locked himself in mourning, refusing food and weeping in regret. He was no longer the young prince chasing glory. He had become something else, a man weighed down by the crown of the world. In 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon to solidify his empire. Plans were underway to explore Arabia, send expeditions to the edge of Africa, and establish a centralized administration that spanned continents. Then came the banquet. Accounts vary. Some say he drank heavily and fell ill. Others hint at poisoning. For days, his condition worsened. He was struck with fever, intense pain, and paralysis. He weakened despite sacrifices, prayers, and desperate care. His generals stood helpless. His soldiers, grief-stricken, demanded to see him. In a final act of will, Alexander allowed them to pass by his bed, silent, one by one. Some wept, others saluted. They had followed him across the world. Now they watched him fade. When asked who should inherit his empire, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." Then he vanished. He was 32. His body did not decay for days, which many saw as a divine sign. A golden sarcophagus was created for him, and his funeral procession spanned thousands of miles. His death created a power vacuum. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up the empire, plunging the known world into decades of war. But the idea he ignited, that empires could be more than conquest, never died. In the chaos following Alexander's death, the question of succession consumed the empire. Roxana, now a widow in a foreign land, was pregnant with Alexander's child. She was vulnerable and the bearer of a symbol, hope for a legitimate heir. Alexander IV, her son, was immediately engulfed in political turmoil upon his birth. The Diadochi, Alexander's generals, claimed to rule in his name, but each harbored personal power ambitions. Roxana, fiercely protective of her child, aligned herself with Alexander's mother, Olympias, who still wielded influence in Macedonia. For a time, they succeeded. Roxana and her son were recognized by name. They were kept in relative safety, moved like chess pieces across the shifting landscape of loyalty and betrayal. But it was not to last. As the wars among the Diadochi dragged on, so did their tolerance for rivals. Roxana and young Alexander became a threat, a living challenge to any claim of kingship. Cassander, one of the rising powers in Macedonia, eventually took them into his protection. In actuality, they were subjected to a gradual demise. Sometime around 310 BCE, Cassander ordered their secret execution. Roxana and Alexander IV were quietly murdered, likely poisoned or strangled, and buried in obscurity. There were no monuments, no songs. The last direct bloodline of Alexander the Great was erased. Their deaths marked the end of a dynasty that had changed the world. But even in their silence, Roxana and her son remained potent symbols of unfulfilled destiny, innocence lost to ambition, and the human cost behind imperial dreams. Alexander left no heir, and his empire fractured almost immediately. His generals, the Diadochi, fought vicious wars over the spoils, but his vision didn't die. Greek became the language of science and art across Asia. The cities he founded became bastions of learning. His story became the template for kings and emperors to follow. He had redrawn the world, not just on maps, but in minds. Alexander was more than just a man. He was an idea. Alexander embodied that true greatness stems not from taking, but from creating. And more than 2,000 years later, his name still carries the weight of legend.